We all know, we all can be friends with Kitty now, which is really nice. And Kitty's published 8 novels, over 35 books for children.
Oh, wow.
Essays, articles, short fiction have all been featured in many national and literary publications. Grew up in Brooklyn, New York, lives there today with her spouse. I don't know if this is still true, but with 2 Pomeranians.
There's only one right now.
One Pomeranian that she describes as yappy and highly indulged.
Oh, yeah.
And there's an awesome photo on your website holding the 2 Pomeranians with like a furry hat on. It's super cute. Also the fiction editor of Lilith, an independent publication with the mission of being a feminist change agent. You like that? In and for the Jewish community that operates to empower women, girls, trans, and non-binary people of every background to imagine and bring about positive change in their own lives and those of the larger community. According to Kitty, she truly loves writing, although it is a very solitary profession. However, unfortunately for us, she embraces every opportunity to connect with her readers, which is how we have Kitty with us this evening to connect with us and discuss her new novel, The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights. Fiona Davis, who's also a New York Times bestselling author, calls Kitty's latest work of historical fiction a haunting meditation on the bonds between mothers and daughters, which offers a fascinating look into historic New York City and New Orleans, sharing that Kitty is a skilled storyteller who has given her audience a beautiful read in The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights. Let's give a warm RJ Julia welcome to Kitty Zeldis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for all of you for coming. I'm sure you're busy and have plenty of other things to do. So I always like to thank people who come out, say books are important. I want to think about them. I want to talk about them. I want to read them. We're kind of a beleaguered species writers, there's a lot of competition. And without readers, we're no one. So I'm very grateful and appreciative for all of mine. Like, what am I doing? Just like talking to myself. And that gets old pretty quickly, I'll do a little of it. So I'll tell you a little bit about dressmakers. And since we're such a small group, I feel like it can be really kind of informal. And I hope there'll be questions and comments. And I thought I'd read a little bit from it. Is that just a touch? Just a touch. I think I've timed it like 6 or 7 minutes. So this book began in New Orleans, though I didn't know that when I first went there in the 1980s with my husband, who was a photographer, and we did lots of road trips together. And he was he'd been there before and he loved it, and he was a little anxious. He thought I might not like it, but he didn't have anything to worry about. I really, really loved it. I love the kind of mixture of cultures. It's not, have any of you been there? Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's not really like any other American city. It's got the French thing and the Spanish thing and the Cajun thing, and it looks so beautiful. The Garden District, the quarter, it's very literary. There are streets named Terpsichore and Errato. It's a very cool place. So after we left, it was very much on my radar, and I found myself drawn to things about, when I read about it. So it was in my reading that I learned prostitution was legal in New Orleans from 1898 to 1917. And this was not because they had any, progressive attitudes like in Amsterdam. It was because prostitution was so deeply entrenched, so virulent, if you will, that the criminals who controlled it were ferocious and scary. Like there were neighborhoods where the police would not go if they were called, that the city government eventually got together and thought the only way we can get a handle on this is to legalize it. Yeah. So that's what they did. There was a 38-block radius starting at Basin Street and then going down to Iberville or North Robertson, I forget, actually I should know this. And it was legal in that area and that area only. So it spanned, a wide range of tastes and, let's say, economic opportunities. There were hovels, shacks called cribs, where you could hire somebody for 50 cents. There were the mansions along Basin Street where, it might be $10. And those mansions, one after the other, were filled with women trying to entice customers, in the windows. And as it happened, it was right across the street, Basin Street, from the train station. So imagine this. Oh my God, what is going on here? Where do I go first? So they had this idea also to publish this little directory of what was available there. And the larger, more extravagant brothels could advertise, pay, but apart from that, every woman who worked in the district, as it was called, or Storyville, after the alderman whose idea it was, Edmund Story, was listed. And I saw one of these books reproduced somewhere. And so there was the ethnicity and the age. So there was one entry that read white, 21, Jewish. Well, I'm a Jewish girl, and like this fascinated me. I thought, Jewish prostitutes in New Orleans? No one told me about this. I need to know about this. And but because, and we did some reading, but being a novelist and not a historian, I really wanted to imagine what would have led somebody to that choice. Because apart from, and we know this now, that many women and girls were coerced into this life, forced, not of their own will. So we're going to put them in a different category. But of those who chose it, I want to think why, like what brought you to that place, that you would make that choice and that decision, because there are many, many poor women who do not make that decision. They do not want to do that. So I was trying to imagine who this person would be and what she would be like and what had brought her to this situation. So I imagined her as a young Jewish woman from Russia, and from a very assimilated family, very much like my own grandmother's family. Her father, she's born Yevgenia, she renames herself when she gets to the United States. Her father owns a tannery, which was a profession Jews were allowed to have because it was so disgusting. A lot of people did not want to do it. One of the chief ingredients was urine. So can imagine what that was like on like an industrial scale of, tanning leather and hides and things. So this character, Yevgenia, her father is murdered. His tannery is burned down. Her mother dies essentially from a broken heart. And she decides to go to the United States, to New Orleans by herself, where she gets a job working for a family in the Garden District, taking care of their child. And she meets a young man and she falls in love with him and she gets pregnant. Not her choice, not too happy about this. And he does want to marry her. He really loves her. He's not a cad, but he dies of yellow fever, which was, a scourge back then. And so she's left alone, in this new place. She loses her job and she finds refuge in the district, first working as a maid in a brothel, eventually a prostitute, and then a madam, finally, a very successful madam on Basin Street. However, in 1917, the United States gets into the First World War. And because New Orleans is a port city, there are hundreds, thousands of sailors, soldiers going back and forth and in and out. And the soldiers and the sailors and the prostitution legalized. This is not a good combination. They are disappearing, getting drunk, getting syphilis. And the federal government steps in and says, we're going to end the legalized prostitution here. And the city pushes back because by this point, it's pretty well ingrained and, it's important to the economy. But in the end, the federal government wins out. So it stops, it doesn't go away, but it's no longer legal. And this character, who is now Beatrice, or B, doesn't want to live as a criminal. She's not interested in that. She's been successful. She's not fabulously wealthy, but she's certainly comfortable and doesn't have to worry about her financial future. And she's kind of left with like too much time on her hands, thinking about what she's done, choices that she's made, and what she can do with the rest of her life. She's not that old. So I would like to read you a little bit about she goes to New York. I would like to read you a little bit about these first days in New York. And then I think we can have some questions and comments, and I hope there will be some. Bee's initial impression of New York was not rosy. In fact, she thought it was an awful city, gray, dreary, filthy. On her very first day in the fabled metropolis, she'd been forced to pick her way through the revolting mess left behind by both horses and dogs, piles of mold-spotted potato skins, rotted lettuce leaves, empty liquor bottles, and the bones of God only knew how many chickens, picked clean. The throngs of people who hurried along the wide avenues appeared dour and in some cases malevolent. The tall, soot-stained buildings seemed to glare down at them. And perhaps worst of all was that New York was so very cold. Bee had spent the first years of her life in Russia, where it's certainly been colder, but the next 3 decades in New Orleans had blunted both her memories of and tolerance for the chill. The biting wind made her eyes tear and her nose run and sliced right through her new coat. It had seemed so fashionable, so chic when she bought it on Magazine Street. And it offered no better protection than a dressing gown. How had she not anticipated this? Alice seemed to share her revulsion, and though she didn't complain, acted as if she'd been bludgeoned into silence. Bee had spent much of their trip north on the New York and New Orleans Limited, prattling on about landmarks she'd read about but never seen. Central Park, the Plaza Hotel, the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Opera House. And the train itself bolstered this glamorous, if imaginary, picture gallery. The observation car with its enlarged windows and sweeping panoramic views, the cunningly designed compartments, the single red rose placed in the bud vase that sat on each table in the dining car. But when they found themselves thrust unceremoniously into the pure bedlam of Pennsylvania Station, Bee felt she deceived Alice, and her own words mocked her. There were so many people, all rushing, shoving, muttering, scowling. Getting out of the terminal was a challenge, and being outside was even worse, what with the teeming sidewalks and streets choked by automobiles, horse-drawn wagons, and bloated, monstrous buses. After 20 fruitless and freezing minutes trying to hail a taxi, Bee finally succeeded. She practically stepped into its path to flag it down. Sitting inside, Alice was clearly terrified. It was the first time she'd ridden in such a vehicle, and she clutched the front seat, alarmed by the speed and the blaring horns of the other motorists around them. When they finally arrived at the hotel on Upper Broadway, they went upstairs, undressed, and went straight to bed. Bee slid down the well of sleep as if drugged. But the next morning, she had to face the city again, pulsating, chaotic, more foreign than she ever could have imagined. Maybe it had all been a mistake, the visit to the detective, the knowledge he'd given her, the plan to come north. Her decision was hardly irreversible, though. She and Alice could just turn around and go back. Of course they could. But back to what? Bee knew her life in New Orleans was over. And since she'd adopted Alice in all but a legal way, the girl's life there was over too. Breakfast the next morning was a subdued meal, with Alice answering only in monosyllables. Bee sipped her coffee in Ersatz bitter brew and began to devise something like a plan. The hotel was a temporary oasis. Thanks to the detective Vernew, she had trained her sights on Brooklyn and a neighborhood called Prospect Heights, where he said Catherine Beryl was living. But even though Bee had the address, she couldn't just show up at the house and announce herself. She had to bide her time and find the right moment. Right moment and the right words, too. She rehearsed them endlessly in her head, but everything she came up with sounded false, hollow, and thoroughly wrong. On the first morning, though, she had a more immediate concern: how to deal with the cold. She thought of the broad avenues of her home city, its denizens draped in fur and leather, elemental materials with which to face the most brutal elements. The hotel concierge seemed a little puzzled by her request, but he consulted a directory and was able to provide the address of a furrier who specialized in secondhand and refurbished garments, whose downtown shop could be reached via the subway at 86th Street. Alice was horrified by the idea of descending underground. She was sure they'd be suffocated or crushed. He didn't like the idea either, but millions of people in New York City traveled by subway, and if she and Alice were to become New Yorkers, they at least ought to try it. Everyone else is doing it. They don't seem afraid. Maybe they're all insane, Alice said as they stood outside the station, or idiots. Bee took her arm and they went carefully down the stairs, avoiding the other people rushing by them. The subway train hurtled into the station almost as soon as they reached the platform, and Alice clapped her hands to her ears. The lurching ride caused her to collide into the woman standing next to her. "So sorry," Bee said to the woman, who glared at Alice with such hostility that Bee put her arm around the girl's shoulders, an instinctive gesture of protection. When the woman exited the train at the next stop, Bee felt something inside of her unclench, just a little. She'd get used to it. They both would. The address she sought was only a couple of short blocks from the subway station. After climbing a narrow and splintered flight of stairs, Bee tapped on the frosted glass door whose block lettering read, "Ned Rappaport, furrier." A man she assumed to be Rappaport opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for them. Come in, he said genially. His Russian accent was as thick as her own had once been. Bee looked around the showroom where animal pelts were tacked to the walls, stuffed onto shelves, and piled on every available surface, including the floor. There were also a pair of sewing machines, a battered mannequin, and a metal rack crammed with coats, mostly made of fur, but several cloth as well. You'd like to see a fox, maybe? Rappaport asked, or a sable? It belonged to a fancy lady, and she wore it only a few times before she dropped dead. May she rest in peace. No fox, he said. No sin. And I want your best price, since I'm going to be buying 2 furs, one for each of us. She gestured toward Alice, now stroking the arm of a leopard jacket. Then she began to look through his merchandise methodically until she found 2 suitable coats that she tried to wrestle from the tightly packed wrap. Let me. Rappaport struggled a moment before he finally freed them both. Mink, a good choice, warm but light, won't weigh you down. Do you and the young lady want to try them on? Alice slipped hers on and stood before the dust-streaked mirror. The fur was worn away at the cuffs and pockets. It's very soft, she said, but it's not in such good condition. Bea nodded. The one she'd selected for herself was even more flawed. There were several slashes between the pelts, as if someone had gone at them with a knife. I'll let you have them cheap, Rappaport said eagerly, for the price of cloth practically. I'm not done yet. Bea answered him in Yiddish, a language she knew just well enough to construct this simple sentence. Rappaport looked surprised. So did Alice. Du bist ein Yid? The furrier asked. You're a Jew? In Russia, the answer to that question would have been fought, but in the United States it was less so. A cause for derision at times, but not a blow to the face, a kick to the groin. Bea nodded and returned to the rack, where she pulled out 2 more coats, one of black wool and the other camel, both quite large. When Bea asked her to take off the fur and try the camel, Alice seemed disappointed. The fur would be warmer, she said. Of course it would. That's why I'm going to ask Mr. Rappaport to use it as a lining. He turned to him. Could you do that? You want to buy a fur only to hide it? Not hide it. Use it in a different way. In this new life, she would need practicality, not opulence. She handed him Alice's mink so she could try on the black coat. Immediately, she was enveloped by the volume of fabric. Perfect. You could do the same with this one. Use the other mink to line it, take it in where you need to. The condition of the pelts won't matter, though you'll have to stitch mine back together. And we could use belts. She pulled the coat away from her body so that it formed a tent. There's enough material here for that, isn't there? Plenty, said Rappaport. Excellent. How soon can you do it? Tomorrow, maybe, the next day for sure. What about tonight? Tonight, I don't know. I'll have to get a helper. You have 2 machines, Bea pointed out, and I'll pay you extra. All right, Rappaport said. I'll back at 8. Once they were out of the shop, Alice asked, what language were you speaking back there? That it was. Just then, a passing automobile came dangerously close to Alice, and Bea yanked her from the curb and then cautioned her about keeping far back from the traffic in the future. The topic of languages slid away. When they returned to the shop some hours later, Rappaport was ready for them. He was good at what he did. The coats were well tailored, stylish, and best of all, warm. And since his helper was still there, Bea bought a moth-eaten mink jacket and had the woman fashion 2 fur headbands, one for her, one for Alice, that fit snugly around their ears. What a good idea, Rappaport said. I'm going to have Minnie make a few more. I'll bet I'll sell them all by the end of the week. Bea looked at Rappaport. You're a good businessman, she said. And you, madam, you're an even better businesswoman. Bea froze. How could he have known just how apt a statement that was? Was he mocking her, insulting her? No, she was overwhelmed, that was all. Of course Ned Rappaport didn't know who she'd been or what she'd done. There was no way he could have. And she'd taken the precaution of changing her name yet again. Now she was Beatrice Jones, just to make sure that her past couldn't catch up with her. And as she ushered Alice out of the shop and back into the darkened but still busy street, she was even more determined to make sure that it never would. So there was Bea in New York for the first time. And I hope you will read more about what happens to her and Alice and everything else.
Well, you already answered my first question, which was why New Orleans? So you said your research led you to learn about a prostitute who was listed as a Jewish prostitute. I'm shocked.
I don't know why. I mean, you know.
I don't know why.
not, but
My mother-in-law would be able to tell me why.
well, I have, my family has an immigrant story, and I've known lots of other immigrant stories, but I haven't heard that one. So it
Sure.
How, I mean, the creative part I get, giving life to this person who's booked or would seeing, as her job. But the research is just amazing to me how you make it seem so easy. And that's why I love historical fiction, because it brings people alive, but there's a historical background. So how do you go about that? Like, where did you do your research? At the library or?
Yes, and I went to New Orleans again, to do a research trip, but I will say that B was also modeled in part, the early part, not the prostitute and madam part, on my grandmother, who was never a prostitute or a madam, and probably never even went to New Orleans for all I know. But my grandmother was from Russia and was from a very assimilated, wealthy family, and she was an awful woman. I have to say this about her. I mean, she was traumatized and she was difficult, crazy, angry. I did not get along with her. I don't think she liked me much either. And she would, try to tell me stories about her life, and I'd be like looking at the watch and tapping my foot, and she would tell me the most harrowing stories, like at the worst moments, like she had lost several children, and she told me all these stories in great detail when I was pregnant for the first time, like not a good
Oh my
time to
goodness.
tell somebody about losing a baby, right? So when she died, I was in my 40s, she was in her 90s. I was really surprised at the overwhelming grief that I felt, and regret that I had not been more understanding, that I had not been kinder, that I had not been more compassionate, and thinking about her life. And I began writing about her, first in short stories, in which I attempted to give her back her dignity and her agency in ways that I couldn't seem to do when she was alive. And when I was starting to think about this character, I felt like that early life, and she had told me how her father died, and I don't want to tell you now, because I hope you will read it, because I use it in this novel, but I wanted to write that. I wanted to write that story and have it be in the world, and as hers. I mean, not that it's history, as I say, but that's okay with me. I have no problem with it not being, there are details that I don't know, and I just made them up. But like the core of it is true, that he was murdered in this hideous way, and that was part of her trauma. Like, that's like, she was a little girl when that happened. And one thing I did not include in this novel, because I just thought, oh my God, it's too much already. Her mother tried to poison herself after her father was killed. And she said to me, I remember the burns around her mouth. Kind of detail like that you don't make up,
Yes.
Well, she didn't die. Whatever it was she took didn't kill her. And so she rallied and sold everything in their house and took her 5, she had many children, and many of them by this point were grown, and married and lived elsewhere, but she took her 4 or 5 youngest children first to Riga and then to the United States. So
First to where?
To Riga, which was a port city in where is Riga? It's in
I think it begins with a V.
it's in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
I know this
Yeah.
too. And I
Belarus? No.
maybe. I mean, it's one of those things that keeps changing.
Yeah.
It's
one of those countries.
People keep grabbing it and then someone else getting it back. And I would like to go there, actually. But and then they came because it was a big port, so they could travel from where they lived in Russia to this port and then take a ship to the United States. I didn't include that, but the sense of trauma and that she carried with her, I was interested in that, and I was feeling more, as I say, compassionate about it. Like I wished I had been nicer to her when she was alive.
What's in Latvia?
Latvia, there you go.
It has AV, but it's not there. I have to look it up.
I did kind of know that at one point, and it also I read the best still existing Art Deco facades in all of Europe that have not been destroyed. So that would be a reason why I share to see that.
It talks all about it here, so
See? Okay.
now I know.
So my question is sort of related to yours. One of the things I love the characters, I love the plot and where it's going, but one of the things that is really masterful is how you draw these scenes. And you actually read 2 of my favorite ones. One is when they get off the train into New York City, the train, right? Yeah, and then when they walk into the Furriers, there's another one where you're describing all the dresses, and I just feel like I'm in the dress shop in the
Fashionable.
Furrier's place. So whether it's the scene that you just read about the Furrier or the dress shop with all the different dresses, how much of it was research? How much was imagination? Or like sort of how did you get there, if you can remember? Because it struck me as like incredible detail, like the stuff on the walls and just, I feel like I can see it, I can smell it, I can see them moving through the shop. And then how much of it is imagination, and maybe how long did you have to rewrite it?
That scene didn't have any trouble with. There were a lot of other scenes I had trouble with and locations. It's always a mix, but you pointed in a way to the answer, although maybe you don't know it. I've taught writing, and like one of the things I've said in class is like, your five senses are your best friends here. Your character, what does she see? What does she smell? What does she hear? What does she feel? Just, you don't have to answer all those questions all the time. In fact, I don't think you should, because it would get like a little bit cumbersome. But if you just have them in your mind, and you can use one or two at salient moments, we as humans, we don't have a very good sense of smell compared to most other animals. So when somebody smells something, it sort of means a lot, right? Because our sense of it isn't that strong. So when it registers, either as something pleasant or something unpleasant or something that reminds us of something, it's powerful. So, you just want to make use of that when you can, like in trying to imagine a scene, like, seeing, feeling, hearing, touching, like what are all those, what's happening there? And that kind of gets you into it. And I don't think it matters if you make it up a whole lot, as long as it's credible, as long as it's true to itself.
And that does feel like it. Had you been in a furrier shop that you drew on?
There was a furrier that I knew up on the west side, in fact, when my first apartment, but no, he didn't do that.
Sure.
Just just what I've gleaned about, such places. It's not a fancy place, right? It's kind of like a low end place.
Well, I've been in that shop,
You've been
which
in
I
that.
totally forgot. Now, in college, I went to New York. To one of those places, like to come back to campus with 3 furs. And I totally, I'm like, oh my God, and I could see the metal racks. I remember riffling through it, and I remember looking for the seams to see, but I totally forgot until that scene. Well, yeah.
But you got your
And I
friends.
came back to stores with my 3 furs.
And your friends are probably way impressed.
Oh, yeah. I was.
But that's cool how it like put you back.
Yeah. I can't remember what street it was anymore. I totally forgot.
In Midtown somewhere,
Yeah,
like the garment
a
district.
lower,
A little lower,
like,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very, very true to that experience. Yeah.
Well, you're very fashionable, and your grandmother, was she very fashionable? Is that was the idea of a
She was
dressmaker?
actually, and she was a good seamstress. I am not. I like to say that I, aspired to be Martha Stewart, and it ends up looking like Lucy and Ethel. I might be okay with that. but I'm not. So, I have to outsource that part of my life. Someone else doing it for me.
But would your grandmother have come up with this idea to make something warm, go with the fur on the inside?
She might have. Yeah, she might have. She was good at remaking things. She would take things, and she was also very small. And at a time, I mean, now there's like petites and everything, but then when she was younger, there wasn't. And she didn't want to wear little girls' clothes. She wasn't interested in that. So she would always have a seamstress, come to her house, although she was not a rich woman when she was, married to my grandfather. But that was something she thought was important enough to spend money on, and she wanted things to be just so and to fit her nicely. There are pictures of her I have where, she definitely has a style. I like that. And my mother was a very glamorous woman, not in the traditional sense, perhaps. I mean, like back in the 60s, she didn't do the beauty parlor or the nails or anything, but she was incredibly glamorous. And to me, and I can tell you what she wore in 1964, not only the outfit, but the accessories that went with it. I was very smitten with her.
Can you tell us a little about the other dressmakers in the?
Well, there's actually only one, and she is
Okay.
Alice. There are 3 women
Oh,
in
that's
the
a
story.
possessive dressmaker.
Yes, yeah, but there are two.
Okay.
And Alice is a girl that B meets in New Orleans. Her sister is a prostitute and works for B, and her mother was a prostitute, and her mother dies, and then her sister dies. So Alice is an orphan, and be kind of, quasi, I mean, she doesn't legally adopt her, but she lets her stay. And
Mhm.
Alice is a very good seamstress, and that's part of what, she offers. Her sister thinks that she can work as a prostitute
Ah,
too, which is something, I mean, I did research, and the selling of children, which was allowed, was very lucrative. There were people who would pay a great deal to be the first, to have his way with a 10-year-old child or something, but I know, but B will not have that. She said, I'm not selling children. Like, if she wants to do this when she's 18, she can decide to do this, but not before then. So Alice is very grateful that she's not being forced into this. And she wants to make herself useful in other ways. And she's terrible in the kitchen. She's dropping things and breaking things and, letting things boil over, but she's good with a needle. So that sort of becomes their contract in a way. Like she does that, and so she feels like she's sort of earned her place, and B is happy to have that. And so they do that. And when she leaves New Orleans, she brings Alice with her. Well, she does not tell her why. And I don't want to tell you why, except she's in search of someone who is the other character in this novel.
Okay.
So they were dressmakers back in New Orleans?
no.
No, she was a prostitute, she was a madam back in
Right.
New Orleans,
Okay.
but
Okay.
since she ran a fancy brothel, she had use for a seamstress
Okay.
in her employ. She wanted the women well dressed, and here was somebody who could help with dressing them, either making clothes or mending clothes or altering clothes. So there was plenty for her to do.
And she has a sense of style that is sort of new for New York,
Mhm.
right? So she brings sort of an aesthetic with her, and it sounds like she's sort of looking around her, bringing what she brought and creating something new.
Ah.
Because the dresses they make are kind of amalgams. They get older dresses, and they get other dresses, used dresses, and then they kind of reconfigure them, reconfigure them, and they do something new with them. So there probably wasn't a lot of that going on, but hey, it's a novel. That's right. And it really seems to me true to these two women. Like, yes, they would figure out how to do that. And it gives them like a little cachet, and it makes the shop different from other shops, because it offers this, the dresses are one of a kind, essentially.
So my other question is, just reading like everything you do, I don't know if you have time to read anything else, but who are some of the authors that you like, whether they're contemporary or the authors that you've liked throughout your life, or who have inspired
Well,
you?
those are two very different questions.
Okay.
And I put this question to audience members when I get asked this, because I'm curious. When I was a child, I reread my favorite books like 20 times.
Yes.
Did you do that?
Yes.
It wasn't, it was like meeting an old friend. But I never do that. I mean, I reread poetry. I like poetry a lot, and I will read, but I never read a novel, almost never. I might read a short story here or there, but it's something I kind of miss, that sense of, familiarity, and that you might see something new. But here's the thing about being a writer, and it's really a great life, and the second best thing I could have imagined doing. I wanted to be a ballerina, but seriously, I really did it, for many years, every day and all that. And was neither good enough nor driven enough to make a life of that. So I had to relinquish that. But being a writer does interfere with my reading. Both because when I'm working on a novel, if I read someone else's novel, it's like I'm hearing static, like on a radio, and I'm trying to tune in and hear something, to hear a voice in my head, and someone else's voice is in there, and it gets in the way. And then even when I'm not writing a novel and I read, I don't read in the same kind of voluptuous, immersive way that I did. And I bet you were all readers like this, where, when I was a kid, if something else would intervene, I said, don't talk to me, I'm reading.
Yes.
And now I'm like so aware of how this thing is made, so that, even when I like it, I say, oh, I see how she's doing that. That's really good. Or I wouldn't have done it that way. No, that was a mistake. And I have this inner dialogue with myself, and I want to tell myself, just shut up and let me read. Okay. Stop. No, I'm asking you now. You're reading, not editing or not analyzing, but I can't turn it off. I really can, and
Wow.
it's disappointing, but there's so many other things I like about it, I just have to live with it, and anyway, there are lots of things that disappoint you as you get older anyway, right? So live with that too, you know, just have to adjust and make the best of it. I still read, but not the same, yes.
So do you have a practice to invite that voice in that speaks to you as you write?
Oh, I like the read.
Mm.
I will say something that maybe you found too. When my time was more constrained, I think I used it better. Like when I had school age children, I wrote when they were in school. Like everything else, you know, everything else waited, everything else was around that. Like from 9 to 3, I had 5 days a week. And I give myself a quota, 2 pages a day. Sometimes I did more, but if I could do those 2 pages, and then I stopped when they came home because I thought they deserved a mother who didn't say what in a crappy voice. When they said to them, I wanted them. So now my time is more my own, and I have to say I don't use it quite as well, but I still, you know, I kind of treat it like a job.
Okay.
Like I have coffee in the morning and, you know, something to eat, and then I go to work, and then I have lunch, and I also have a dog. And so the dog, it's like, you know, she sort of regulates the day because she has to be
Yes.
fed and she has to go out.
Mhm.
So, you know, we do that. You know, I take her out, I feed her, and so then, you know, and if I'm really involved in something, I might work again after dinner, but generally not something new. I'll be looking over what I've done that day and kind of, you know, tweaking it and poking it a little.
So you're disciplined.
Well, yes, yes. I mean, it has been my job for a long time. So if I don't do it, like, then I don't have any other means of support. So I need to do it.
Speaking of means of support, do you have something else in mind, or do you always you know, do you say, I'd like to touch on this, I'd like to return to this, or I'd like to write about this? Is there something?
Well, I do have something with this novel. Really was a difficult one to write, and I'm not sure why, but in its initial draft, much more of it took place in New Orleans, and they only came to New York at the end. And my editor said to me, you know, I think that chapter or 2 in New York is actually where the book comes to life, and I see you really need to think about setting more of it in New York and using New Orleans as a backstory. That was very demoralizing, I must say. But I do think she was right. And I did what she said. So when I finally finished it, it was accepted. I thought, you know what? I don't have to write another novel, like ever. For a while. I write children's books. I always have 2 projects going at the same time. So that one of them isn't going well, I can go back to the other one. And then, you know, usually 2 don't go badly at the same time. So then after I've worked on the second one, then it restores my confidence and I could go back to work on the one that wasn't going so well. So I thought, I have some ideas for children's books that I want to do, and I'll do those. And then I got an idea that just kind of swept me up and shook me by the shoulders and said, you're gonna write me. And I started it. So I'm working on that now.
Oh, so something else to look forward to.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I don't want to say too much about it lest I jinx it, except it's set in the 1940s, which is much easier than the 1920s. Just saying, any of you historical fiction people out there, I think there's some periods that are simply more accessible to us because there's just more available. Like the 40s are a lot of movies, photographs, you know, that you don't even realize are helping form your idea, you know, your understanding of this time. Whereas at the 20s, there's a lot less.
Right.
There really is. I mean, photography was,
The
I mean,
ability to record.
right,
it.
right. Photography existed, but it was much more formalized. You don't see as much of it. You know, magazines didn't have so much photography in them. They had, you know, drawings and other kinds of illustrations. So it's just not as visually available. And I will not say it's like in the 20s again. I will not. I really am happy about it. And yet I felt like I had to because I wanted that arc of the prostitution story. And that's when it took place. You know, and if it ended in 1917, even setting it, in fact, I think I had it beginning sooner. And then also an editorial suggestion was that the 20s, that was sort of like a kind of nebulous period, like 1917 to the early 20s. And my editor said, you know, the 20s are kind of more defined, and maybe you want to think about that, like other things happening. And I thought about that, and I thought, yes, actually, I like the idea of setting it in the 20s, that it seemed more appealing to me than setting it in 1918. So I did that, but I won't do it again.
How long did it take you to write this?
It seems like forever. I don't know, a couple of years, 2, 3, I just kept going back and back and back.
Did you have a method to approach this? Did you start sort of at the beginning and then you got your editor's input, so you shifted it, or did you kind of have the end in sight? And
No, I
backtrack,
had a
or-
completely different ending. As I said, they got to like the end of the first few drafts, they end up in New York.
Yeah.
I didn't
Okay.
write any of the New York chapters at all, and I had Margaret Sanger as a character.
Okay.
I done research about her for a middle grade project that never came to pass, but I found the research very interesting, and it seemed like a good place to use it. And actually, abortion was more of a theme in the book. It still exists in here, but it's not so front and center.
Mhm.
So it went through a lot of changes, but I tend to work quickly and then have to revise a lot. I have many drafts. I have a friend who's a writer whose work I admire enormously, and her first draft and her final draft are much closer together than mine was. She works more slowly and in a more considered way, and so, you know, she just has like a different rhythm to it. My grandfather used to call me when I was a little girl, Schnell, which means fast. So I have to do it fast, and I have to redo it many times. So my drafts actually are very different from one another. And I experimented with point of view in this. I had it told in the first person, which is different than talking to writers, because you have a different, you know, this is
What do you call it? Would you call it limited third?
yes, exactly. The first person gives you like a great.
So limited third, can you explain that just so we all understand?
Yeah.
what that is?
Well, maybe there are 3 different points of view in this, and you get each of them, you know, intimately.
Almost like you're looking over their shoulder, as opposed to it being like the camera being further back.
Further back, right, you get a close third, but you don't get, like, when you're in that person's point of view, you don't get other points of view. You know, it's not an omniscient point of view, and the first person can give you great immediacy, but it also is limiting because you only have the one character, and I felt like the other 2, well, first there was only another one, and like they weren't coming alive, the other characters, because there wasn't a way to get closer to them. And then there was one that I did not even plan on being in the story. She was totally off stage. It was a reference to her. And my editor said, I think you are missing a great dramatic opportunity in not bringing this character into the story in the present. And I sulked about that for a while.
I like this editor, just like the editor.
She's not a good editor. I must
Yeah.
say. She puts like a lot of work.
Yeah.
It is a lot of work. What can I say?
Do you think you wound up with a better book? Do you feel that you did? or-
Definitely, it's a better
Oh,
book
okay.
from my original conception of it, and she really pushed me to that. So for a while, I just felt like, I don't want to write her. I don't know who she is. I'm not gonna, you know, I just so. And then literally one day she started talking to me.
Nice.
Like,
Wow.
there are moments when being a writer, you hear voices and you feel like you are not, see, you're all nodding. 'cause you're- You're not inventing it, you're transcribing it.
Yes.
Like, like you are a vessel for, so like someone has tapped you on the shoulder and said, listen, I have something really important to tell you, and you have to get it right. And like, that's your job, like you're getting it right, like the voice is flowing through you, you are the conduit, not the originator. It doesn't happen all the time.
That's amazing.
It happens enough to make it like worth doing. And when she started talking to me, I was really excited and I really liked her and I wanted to write her point of view. You know, maybe some people can write a whole novel that way. I don't know. I think just because of the time it takes to write a novel, I don't think you can be in that kind of swoon state the whole time. You know, like maybe you could write a poem like that, or even a short story, you know, where you sit down and you bang out a 25-page draft without getting up. But a novel is long. Like other things, like you have to eat and sleep, and in my case, take the dog out, right? Like so things get in the way. And Dominic Dunn, who I can't say is a favorite novelist of mine, but I love this line. He said, sometimes writing a novel is just like ringing pipe.
Yes.
And I'm like, yeah, that's true. Sometimes like you have to get somebody from here to there, and certain information has to be conveyed, and like, you just gotta find a way to do that, and like, get that to happen. And it's not the most exciting thing there is, but, you know, the whole thing has to fit together, and you have to be able to, you know, transition. So there have to be these parts that let you do that. So they might not be the most exciting parts, but they're necessary.
That's awesome. So we
And
have,
when do you, oh,
I was like, no, I was gonna say we have time for one or two more questions and then we're gonna move to the signing. So.
when do you know you're finished?
Wow.
Oh, that's
a hard question, because I thought I was finished several times. I was actually finished. So, I don't know. Really.
Wait, and would you say I'm gonna share this with my editor?
I thought I was finished, and she said, I could publish this book, you know, this manuscript, just as it is. It's as good as many published manuscripts. It's better than some, but I think it can be better. And, you know, I would like you to try to make it better. And I thought I should do that, both for the larger goal of creating the best book I could, but also for a practical reason, which, you know, as aspiring writers, I feel like I want to share with you, which is, although it feels when you are working with an editor or an agent, like a very intense personal kind of connection, it is and it isn't. At the end of the day, it is business. And it doesn't matter how much somebody likes you or they enjoy working with you. If your book doesn't sell, you're not going to get another contract. And that is just the cold hard truth. And you know, most of us as writers, we want to keep writing. Like there's like nothing else I can do at this point in my life. You know, like I'm sort of like all the other opportunities have dried up, or you know, I've just moved beyond them or whatever. You know, I'm not capable of doing them. So like I want to keep doing this, and so I have to think of those practical considerations and not just the, you know, artistic or even spiritual ones. And I wasn't I've written a few novels that have not been published, and there were two that I wrote as a younger woman. And my first published novel I was 45, so that's not such a kid, right? I mean, and I had this great editor and a big book advance. It was from Doubleday, and I kind of thought, like, wow, you know, it's and that book, for which I was paid a lot of money, didn't sell. And then it was a 2-book deal, so they published another book that sold even worse. They declined to publish the next manuscript, and I was really kind of crushed in a very naive way. Like I thought, like, you know, it's sort of like almost like a boyfriend. Like I thought, like, you said you love me,
Right.
They were just trying to get something out of you.
You know, I trying to ruminate on this, and I don't have bitterness. It's just like now I think about her perspective. Like she has to go to her boss and say, "Oh, remember that woman I paid all that money to, and neither of those books did very well. I want to buy another book from her." Like, how about no?
Right.
You know, how about like her job is, I don't want to say in jeopardy, but you know, like it's her job to pick books that are going to do well. I mean, that's her goal, is to have successful books that earn money for her publishing house. You know, not simply that she loves and wants to publish, but that other people love and want to pay for. So yeah, and I actually think understanding that was useful to me. So that too made me think of what my editor was saying. She wasn't going to force me to it, but I thought, you know what, if the book doesn't sell and she told you that she thought it could be better and you declined to take that advice, well, that's going to be on you. Yes.
To go off of that. So your editor, is she, when she reads your manuscript, is she thinking about, okay, how big of a readership can this book bring? Okay, so she bases and the type of readership it is and how large it's going to be. So she determines all of that.
That's right.
And has that in her head, and
Yes.
as you're revising.
And she brings in sales and marketing, and you know, like they actually have more input into editorial than ever before. They came up with this title, sales and marketing.
They came up with the title.
Yeah, they did. And
Did you have one?
excuse me,
Did you have one?
lots of them, but no one were taken. There was one, what was one of the early ones? I think The Lost Daughter. And like Elena Ferrante had that, one. So that was not an idea to take that. One. Was a good novel, right? She's a very good writer. But that would not be a good, I mean, even though titles are not copyrighted and you make sure you see them, but that wouldn't be a smart thing to take a title from a book published so recently that was so successful.
And it's just not this.
Not at all,
It's
not at all this. So I had to let that one go. And so they had this idea of dressmakers, and I said, you know, I did a little quick search on Amazon and there were like 9 books with the word dressmakers in it. And I pointed this out to my editor and said, you know, there's a little dressmaker fatigue here. She said, if you hate it, we will find something else. But I want to point out to you, of those 9 books you told me, 5 of them are on the bestseller list. Okay, I'll take that. And originally this book would have been titled The Dressmakers of Park Slope, which is where I said it and where I live. And they liked Prospect Heights better, like just on a word level. They didn't like Slope.
Right.
They thought Slope
Because
was
it's
down.
That's a word that's not used often, but heights, people in New York live in a heights, in New Jersey, that's more.
And
common.
that's also like literally,
Right.
like Prospect Heights sounds like things are looking up,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Slope sounds like things are going down.
So
So,
it sounds like economics.
yes,
Who wants
exactly.
to know about that?
Right, but even on that level, and I thought, okay, you know, and as it happens, Prospect Heights is an adjacent neighborhood
Oh, yeah.
to Park Slope and very much like it.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
settled at the same time, the same kind of cityscape, row houses, you know, 3 and 4 story, accent near to Prospect Park. So I felt like, yeah, I can put it in Prospect Heights and not change. Some of the streets are even the same. They go from Park Slope to Prospect Heights. They, you know, sort of span that. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. So yes, I bow to certain kinds of
Pressure.
pressure as much as, what did you say?
Informed recommendation.
Oh, wow.
Oh, no, it's And a word I really don't like in terms of literature branding, but hey, that's real.
But you had talked about at the beginning that if you're a writer, you're communicating with the reader and you want to have readers.
That's
and so
right.
They're helping you put your book
Exactly.
into readers'
See, you have a
hands.
very good attitude, and that's the attitude I've adopted too, you know.
That makes
That was, yes, that's right. Like you actually want the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is for the book to reach people.
And
you
I
know,
came tonight because dressmakers is in the title.
excuse
I
me?
mean, specific, right?
Oh,
As
okay.
you know, I read
Wow.
yeah, because there were a list of people this week. I said, dressmakers, I'd like to see what she's got to say about that, or what they've got to say about themselves. So,
Nice. There's lots of talk about.
daughter of a
Yes.
designer,
Oh,
and
nice.
a graduate of FIT.
Oh, wow. Oh, my earlier book, Not Our Kind, has hat maker in it.
Oh, really?
And that was so much fun to do that research about hat making, where the hat making set, that it was in Connecticut. It was in
Danbury.
Danbury.
You read it? No, but I know Danbury.
Oh,
but I
okay.
think-
I remember my mother having these beautiful hat boxes, you know, just on the top shelf in her closet.
G-Fox and Sage Alice. Yeah.
I thought my hat box was better than the hats.
And that was Beatrice Orbach Fox. Yeah, her name was
What's
Beatrice.
this thing getting?
G Fox and Company was a famous department store, and then the Fox family, and her name was Beatrice. So G Fox.
In Hartford.
Yeah, Fox in Hartford. Yeah.
It's like the big.
I just remember the hat boxes from G Fox and Sage Allen's, and
Yeah.
those were the famous
They're in a
ones,
stocking
but
little container.
Well, and before that, there were actually individual millinery shops.
Yes,
in those
yes,
towns.
yeah.
And some of them ended up in the department store, they
Right.
got hired by the department stores.
Right, I
Yes,
worked
yeah.
in Kenny Bendel, which I always said on Bendel.
Oh,
until-
nice.
It's probably the most exclusive store in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When they moved, not so much, they got bought by someone, but
Yeah,
was
for
originally
limited.
was on, was it on 57th Street, and then it moved to, and that brown and white hat box and shopping with
Yeah, well, with 7 o'clock, so we are gonna thank you so much.